David Bohm Seminars, Sunday, March 22nd, 1992, 5:30 afternoon session, Oak Grove School, Ojai, California.
Well, there's a limited time left, and I mean, we might try to. Some people have suggested that we discuss once again the question of the unlimited, which was done, I think, last year, the year before, the year before the last one, right? And and then we want to discuss the question of time a bit, to talk about it. And we're not going to be able to go very deeply into it, but just simply to wind up, which we'd have to do it. We'll start to wind it down about an hour from now. Leave a little bit of extra time after that. So now, see, we're discussing the unconditioned, but we could also look at that as the unlimited. You see, thought is inherently limited because it's an abstraction, you see. And you may extend the thought, but it's still limited. There's no limit to how far you can carry it, but it's always limited. And and anything which could be correspond to thought would have to be in some sense similarly limited. So whatever thought can correctly think about is limited. Now, of course, scientists have been, and other people, religious people have tried to say thought is unlimited. People would know everything about it. It's important, and also science, in its own way, saying that we would eventually. As we said, in the 19th century, they thought they were approaching the limits of thought, which would capture everything, and with Lord Kelvin, as I said, and then the whole thing was transcended as a big revolution of relativity and quantum theory. Now, in the 20th century, we've had a tremendous number of changes with the discovery of the atom with electron, proton, nucleus, quark, fields of various kinds, the expansion of the universe, the apparent starting at a certain time, as if time had started, I don't know, about, what would you say, about 15 billion years ago or so, I can't remember. What you would mean by that is not clear, but it's part of the theory, right? And the theory has some evidence to back it up. But other scientists, a few of them, are saying you could look at it in another way. See, it can always be looked at in several ways. To some extent, it's a matter of preference, the aesthetics of what appeals to the people, and so on. So we don't have certainty in this business. And there are those who say that we're going to get a theory of everything and that physics is finished. Stephen Hawking is one of them. Physics will soon be finished. Science, and that from there on it's a matter of working out all the details and with better and better computers, perhaps. And so it's sort of a deja vu of the 19th century situation, and but it may well turn out that something more is discovered. And you see, so we go on extending the limits of thought, and see, this notion that thought is going to capture everything looks really most implausible, considering the very nature of thought as abstraction. So, and also considering the experience with thought that we've had so far, which by no means suggests a limit. That by no means suggests that thought could capture everything. No, but thought could be extended indefinitely and still be limited. You see. Now, then, if thought is limited, then we must say, is there the unlimited? You see. See, if thought is conditioned, can we say, is there the unconditioned? Right. It's a similar question. And that's a question which is naturally aroused by looking at this thing. The unlimited with the unconditioned, and we could say the unknown, because only what could be put in thought could be known. And okay, now, suppose, however, we said that we have two things, the unlimited and the limited, side by side, but then the unlimited would be limited by not being the limited. Is that clear? So therefore, we can't have that. It doesn't make sense. The suggestion is the unlimited contains the limited. The unlimited limits itself, you see, as it creates a limitation. You see, it determines its own limit. And you could say a work of art is of that nature. It is creative. a work of art determines its own limits, its own form, as an internal necessity. But it doesn't mean that that's everything, you see. Therefore, the limited is really a side or aspect or a part of the unlimited, that what is behind thought is unlimited, but it limits itself. And that could happen freely, or it could happen by conditioning or whatever, you see. So now, I don't think that people, you see, some people have said God is the unlimited. I don't know how serious they are about it. In science, I don't know that people have been very serious about the idea of the unlimited. And the general tendency is always to try to say it's somehow limited. Because if it's all limited, we could get it all, we would know it. And there's a tremendous drive in thought to know it all, to capture it all, to be secure, right? There's a tremendous urge to do that. I think, say, if 1,000 years ago, one could say, even 600 or 700 people could say they knew everything that was known, at least. Now, of course, there's a tremendous amount of knowledge. Nobody knows it all. Most people know only a fragment of it. And it seems to grow and grow. But I would suggest, nevertheless, that there is the unlimited, which knowledge will not get hold of. And unlimited might be subtle and not fixed, and so on, so on. You see, it moves out toward the qualities we call mental or spiritual, subtle. But they may still be limited as far as we could define it, but there's always implicit that beyond all that is the unlimited. Out of which creatively emerges the limited. Therefore, even thought is happening that way. You see, that the movement of thought is basically, it will occur in matter and so on, and ultimately the unlimited. See, we have to say from that view that matter is unlimited. Now, we could then say perhaps mind is also unlimited, parallel to matter, or they perhaps have a common source, or perhaps the mind is simply the move toward the unlimited, the side of the unlimited, more unlimited. There are different ways of looking at that, you see, but we don't have to settle that. And the thing is now that we have to say the ground of our existence is the unlimited. Limiting itself. Now, you see, even if you follow physics, there's sort of a movement, as I said, all the more and more unknown things coming up. Even if you take the vacuum, the empty space, it contains fields which have a lot of energy. And in fact, if you make a rough guess as to what the energy might be, it's really infinite. But if you say that the present laws of physics will break down at about 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, you know what that means, 10 with 33 zeros and a 1, that and something unknown, we don't know at all will take place if at all beyond that, then the amount of energy which is in empty space can be calculated under that assumption. It comes out in 1 cubic centimeter, far greater than all the energy of all the matter in the universe, which would be transmuted into energy. Right? You see, so even a few kilograms of matter is a lot of energy. And that would be an enormous energy. So we could say in some sense it seems that empty space is full. And it is unlimited relative to what we call matter. And perhaps beyond that, there's more of the unlimited, more unlimited than that. But the question, you see, is if space is full, how does it seem to be empty? You see, now, the thing is that sort of thing is common in physics. You see, if we take a crystal, which is quite densely packed with atoms, right? And then the electron is represented by waves passing through the crystal. If the crystal is at absolute zero and perfectly regular, the electron goes right through it. This regular crystal does not scatter it. So to the electron, you could say a space, the crystal is empty. Now, if you raise the temperature, you produce some inhomogeneities, and these will scatter the electron. So to the electron at a higher temperature, it seems that there's various blobs of matter around which could scatter it, but it's mostly empty. Now, that would suggest maybe something similar holds for all matter as we know it, that they are sort of concentrations of energy in empty space which go through the fullness. See, so the space is incredibly full, and you might even argue that maybe it's very highly organized there, and perhaps there is a kind of, I don't know, similar to intelligence in that, you see, but that intelligence may originate there or beyond, if you say it. And the okay, so now that gives us a very different approach than saying that we assert positively what reality is, right? Is that clear what I've been saying? And the yes, so yes, now the question is, you see, whether whether our mind or whatever it is could come in contact with that unlimited. See, this would be the cosmology. See now, if we have, we could say there are three areas in which we could work. One is the area of the individual and the ordinary level of matter. The other, the area of society and the culture. Thirdly, the cosmic area, cosmological. And the now, if we're to bring order into the other two areas, see, at present these two areas are really filling our attention, the social and the individual. If they were brought order and silence, then we should be open to this cosmic dimension. That which would be common to all, you see.
Getting all lined up. If there was less confusion.
Yeah. Well,
because last year I think I heard you say something about paying more attention to the space.
Yes, well, you see, ordinarily we say the space is nothing, but you see, we could also consider that the space is full. The philosophy and science have alternated between space as a plenum and space as nothing. And these are two sides of the same thing, right? Now, is there a space of the mind? Or if the mind, is the mind unlimited? And in this empty space, you see, empty of ordinary thoughts, which would be like the irregularities in matter, which scatter. You could ask, is it possible that that this emptiness would be the contact with the cosmic, you see? Now, the emptiness would contain the limitations, the limited. Right? See, so you could then say that perhaps the unlimited is essentially also empty. It's at least it's sensed as empty from the point of view of ordinary matter and the ordinary level, and yet also it's completely full.
Does this sometimes seem to people when they touch it that it's a bit nerve-wracking? It seems chaotic, and because there isn't a sort of clarity or openness and availability to.
Yes, well, you see, I would say that we don't have a visible ground for the whole thing, but the ground is in the unlimited, and in what we sense as emptiness.
To go back just one step, what is it that would even lead us to speculate that there is, say, intelligence in the unlimited?
Well, we'd have to say if it's limited, you see, the suggestion is the intelligence is unconditioned. It would be able to comprehend all the limits, and therefore it would have to be from the unlimited. That's the suggestion.
Why do we need to even assume an unlimited intelligence?
Well, we could assume limited intelligence, then we say we're going to be ultimately conditioned. You see. Now, if we say there is the unlimited, it would seem that the best place to consider this, the origin of intelligence, is the unlimited. See, this is all a matter of just simply considering the possibilities.
You said that you mentioned in art that how it expresses itself in limited forms in art, and I understand that when Mozart would compose, that he would see the whole thing in an instant.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as if he saw the limited form of the art form, but from the perspective of the unlimited.
Yeah, I mean, he got the whole of it, you see, whereas Beethoven worked out more from the parts, you see, and tried to bring them together to make them harmonize.
Say that the unlimited may comprehend the limited. Any picture I have in my mind as to what that might mean would not be what you were referring to.
Well, what is the picture?
The picture that comes to me first is that something understands in the way that I know understand.
No, comprehend means to hold it together, you see, not necessarily the understanding of the thought process.
Are we saying that in the space between thoughts is this empty space as we the mind as we see it, but that's the fullness of this intelligence,
Or the unlimited, whatever it is.
Insight comes from.
Yeah, that's the origin of that is this empty, the space sensed as empty, but also full.
But it wouldn't be just between the thoughts; it would contain the thoughts.
Yeah.
It's empty in this dimension, but full in the
Yeah, it's empty from the ordinary viewpoint of the ordinary dimension, but full from its own dimension.
Then whatever awareness we get through that intelligence, I would feel it would be transmitted, like picked up from whoever. Like what we're doing here as a group, if we can reach a certain level, it can be picked up without words somewhere else.
Well, I don't quite know what you mean there.
Can this intelligence can be transmitted without words? Can it be?
Yes, well, it will act without words and possibly transmitted, but also intelligence or perception can also act through words. You see that when there's an insight, propose it would come from the unlimited, but the insight would also contain the words which should express it. You see, that the insight to be complete, if it's going to be expressed, would contain also the insight into the words that are going to express it.
When we talk about insight, are we mainly talking about a new understanding?
Well, it's just that an insight will occur which takes hold of the whole. You see, for example, a perception of truth, and it would if we and let's try to put it in another way, that if we have a thought, it may be correct or incorrect. Now, a correct thought is in correspondence with the real object, and that correspondence is very abstract. Right? That, like in a map, there's a line on the map, which is an abstraction from the printed dots, and a line in the country, which is another abstraction. There's a correspondence of abstractions, which enables us to establish the validity of the map. Is that clear? Now, Now, if the thought is incorrect, then the correspondence is not right. You say there's no complete correspondence. Now, or there's maybe a serious error in it. Now, see, a mistake in thought like that is not necessarily, I'm going to call that incorrect. Now, I want to distinguish that between those two and true and false. That, you see, true, we suggested, means straight, honest, and faithful to that which is, and false means not, untrue, deceptive. It engages in illusion, delusion, and collusion. And now you could have a thought which was incorrect, a thought which was correct at least on the superficial level, but in the long run it would be untrue, right? It would start to distort. Or you could even have a thought which was incorrect, and nevertheless it was true. It was true to the situation because it would not hold on to the mistake. It would be part of the truth. See, so I think it's useful to have this distinction. Now, this truth, see, the thought by itself is not the whole story, but we have to ask, what about the conditioning, about all the electrochemical smog and pollution, which is in the nervous system, which is part of that thought, you see. So the insight, I suggest, must also be an insight into that, you see. In other words, that it would clear the whole thing up. And see, that so that you wouldn't hold to the old idea. See, every insight means you are not going to hold to the old idea falsely.
How does that relate to memory?
To what?
Memory.
Yes, well, the source of insight could not be memory, you see, because memory is conditioned.
But then do you remember your insight?
Well, it will affect your memory. You see, if you remember that something has happened, and that if you then it is put as words or as a thought, then that thought could be remembered, you see, and communicated.
One might say that the insight would sort of affect the brain in a non-verbal way.
Yeah. Just as the wind, the subtle wind affects the trees.
Is there a difference between insight into the incorrectness of the thought versus the fact and the pollution itself?
Yes, well, insight into the incorrectness is very simple. You see, it hardly requires insight. If the mind is clear, you just see it's not working. Now it's not in correspondence with the reality or with the fact. Now, the insight is not merely insight into the correspondence of thought and fact, but it's also insight into the way the whole system is working so as to produce deception. And that insight actually touches this material process and starts to dissolve this fog, right? You could think it was very intense and would be able to cut into it.
Then it dissolved all incorrectness?
If it were total insight, you see, but there would be an insight in what we call an insight into some part, which may dissolve some part.
Into some part of the pollution?
Yeah. See that. Well, for example, we can give you an example that we were discussing the development of physics or science. Through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the time of Newton, and the old idea was that heavenly and earthly matter are basically different. There was a lot of evidence that accumulated that they're not basically different, right? That you have irregularity. They're not, heavenly matter is not perfect. It has irregularities. The moon has irregularities. Other planets have satellites. But there's not a great difference. So, but people, in a way, were aware of that. But in another compartment of the mind, they still said heavenly and earthly matter are different. Huh? So therefore, they didn't bring the two together. Huh? See that. In a way, that was the pollution, holding to the old idea, being more comfortable. Now, in order to have this insight, it was necessary. What happened, according to the story, was that Newton was watching this apple fall from a tree, and he saw that he must have had in the back of his mind that there was no difference between this and the moon. You see that. If the apple is falling to the ground, so is the moon. They're not really different. And then the other point is that since it's far from the Earth, it follows a curved orbit, it never reaches the ground. That could be worked out. Right? Now, this insight freed the mind from this conditioning that earthly and heavenly matter are very different. You see, if you believe that heavenly and earthly matter are very different, that gave an explanation of why the moon doesn't fall, because it stays in the sky where it belongs, right in heaven. Now that explanation was, proposed in the ancient times. But if you say the moon is not very different from the apple, you see, then you ask, why isn't the moon falling, right? And Newton's insight was, first of all, to get free of the fact that, notion that they're very different. And secondly, then immediately followed, the moon is falling, that there is a gravitational attraction of everything for everything. And that in this way, a totally different organization of the whole thing was implied. Is that clear? See, so you had to somehow dissolve this attachment to the old idea, which remained even though there was a lot of evidence against it. It was unconscious.
Refer to that as insight.
Yeah.
But it suddenly brings to mind the ideas of de Bono and lateral thinking, which is almost a mechanical way of inciting this kind of thought process, isn't it? Or
well, how would the mechanical... You see...
laterally rather than...
Yes, but it's not really thinking laterally, but thinking freely, unconditionally, you see. Once you get free of the attachment to the old idea, then it's not a very big step to see what the new one is.
No, really.
But what is it that attaches you to the old idea? It's this conditioning. Now, the insight must be not only into the structure of the thought and the fact, but also into this attachment. Now, this attachment, I say, is a material process. It's a neurochemicals, perhaps, somewhere. And the suggestion is that the insight will sort of dissolve that without dissolving the whole set of neurochemicals. It dissolves it intelligently. You see, if you just blasted the whole set of neurochemicals, you would be lost, right? Totally disorganized. But it sort of sensitively touches all those neurochemicals that are responsible for holding to that particular thought. Right? See,
the disorder of the conditioning path. The disorder.
Yeah.
The inside, like a very powerful weapon, dissolves or destroys the disorder of the conditioning.
Yes, it changes the material process so that it removes that particular source of disorder.
So the rigidity then is affected of the conditioning thought.
Yes, that's right. The rigidity, and you see, we have in politics a great deal, or in religion a great deal of rigidity, and you might get an insight that would free. See, the mere seeing of what is incorrect or correct doesn't free the mind because it's still held by this chemical process. And the insight, I say, goes deeper. It touches this material process. And then from there on, it's a fairly easy thing to say what the next step is. So it's not really that thinking is lateral or vertical or so on, but really, why didn't it occur before, you see?
Yeah.
And no amount of lateral thinking is going to get you free of the conditioning.
So insight is somewhat like a laser in the coherent aspect of it?
Yeah. And it's sort of a very finely tuned cutting laser. You see, it's being used in the body in that way. The lasers, which are very well controlled, are being used to cut deposits of cholesterol in the arteries, or cut it into organs and remove them very accurately and so on, without opening the whole cavity of the intestine or something like that.
Kind of the speedy lightning that comes. We do never know when it comes. We can never calculate the time.
No, it's coming from the unlimited. Knowledge must put some limits on how it's going to work, and see, we can't predict it. But I'm suggesting that there can be this insight, and the insight may then extend not only from the scientific conditioning, but also the economic conditioning, the political conditioning, or it may extend into the whole conditioning of the ego, right? Maybe which would begin to affect it all. But that would require much more power than just to see the scientific conditioning on a particular problem.
Say, Newton had this insight because of his interest in that particular subject. He no doubt dwelt on it for a long time.
He did work on it a long time, yes, with great passion. Right?
So, could you make an analogy of someone who is interested in dialogue and in himself and in thought as it operates within us, then insight would be acting within that area.
Yeah. Yes. You see, anybody who works in that area must work very hard, and he's frustrated, he's suffering. And at a sudden stage, the insight comes which releases it all. Right?
Can you count on that?
Well, no, you can't. But I suggest that's the sort of thing that seems to happen, right?
Maybe.
See, so somehow this totality of suffering, or a very broad area of it, could be sort of dissolved in the insight, right? The conditioning that causes us to go on with it, right?
Krishnamurti used to talk in terms of the river of sorrow.
Yeah.
The river of sorrow. And I remember one phrase where he said something that the ending of sorrow is the beginning of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, but the question, can you count on that? It's an interesting way of looking at it. When sorrow ends, perhaps wisdom.
Yeah. Wisdom, understanding, perception, insight. You see, the sorrow is electrochemically is stuck in the brain cells somehow. It's perhaps in the synapses of the nerves, right? Connecting them up in a fixed way. I want to say that it's part of the material process, but sorrow seems to go far beyond that. Right? But the point about sorrow is it's sort of tremendous depth and range. You see, especially when you find the whole river of sorrow, of suffering. Whereas, you see, the particular suffering you have in trying to work with this, discover something new in science or in various other limited areas, that will liberate energies in a particular area. But then we could think that a much greater passion, which will liberate a much more extensive energy, more deeper.
You used to say, don't escape sorrow.
Yeah. Well, once you escape sorrow, you don't. What happens is it gets covered up, and then the suffering is not clear. And you see, the perception needed to make the insight possible is no longer there. But see, escaping anything in that way, it's not really an escape, but it's a covering up.
When insight happens to one, that affects the rest, can affect the rest.
Well, it could. I mean, to some extent, Newton's insight was communicated to everybody. You see, it depends partly on the passion that the people would share. But it may be communicated in a superficial way as just a further conditioning.
Or maybe some people take it deeper and some people more superficial.
Yeah, so, that means that, you see, up to a certain point, somebody like Newton stayed with the suffering of not being frustrated and not being able to see the answer, being confused. And then it broke through in that area. Now, we want to suggest that it's really coming from the unconditioned and the unlimited. That if it were conditioned and limited, then there may be the total insight must come from that. There are limits on this insight which Newton had. So it's coming from something less conditioned or greater, but is there an insight which would come from from really the unlimited? Therefore not be subject to being a limited insight.
Have to be
somehow limited when it entered the domain of the limited.
Yes, well, it would be limited, but it would be limited only in the sense that it would deal with a limited range of, say, in one person, and a greater insight would be one which might be shared by a group in a dialogue.
How would you explain the fact that if the limited is all it is, unlimited is all it is, it isn't.
What?
If the unlimited actually has to contain all that is and isn't, in a sense. In other words, it can contain all the falsity. So an insight could deliver false knowledge.
Well, the unlimited doesn't contain, it contains the thought, and it contains that is false in the sense of untrue and deceptive, right? But this insight perceives the truth of the false, right? You see, that the truth is that it is distorted and so on.
But I'm suggesting that occasionally people have the experience which is similar to the sort of insight, that feels similar to the sort of insight you're saying, which tells them that they're the new Messiah and they have to go kill everyone to
but then,
whatever. I mean,
no matter what we talk about, it can always be imitated by the conditioning and be the false, right?
the falseness comes at the level of the limited as opposed to...
Yes, but the false comes in not only at the level of the limited, but having this confusion between the object, between the thought and the memory and and say the feeling or whatever it is that reflects it.
The ultimate insight would be of the unlimited.
Well, I don't know. I suppose it'd be, from the unlimited.
Insight of that there was the unlimited.
There is the unlimited, but also the limited is the unlimited.
Which is thought and clear up all these smaller difficulties.
Oh, that's an insight.
David, when you and Krishnamurti talked about the ending of time, you were discussing thought time. So you were discussing really the ending of thought, except as useful in everyday life. Could you say a little bit more about that aspect?
I don't know. I think we ought to discuss the meaning of time. You see, I say that we said time is the order of successive existence, which is an abstraction from that order, right? You see, time that doesn't exist in a way. It's an abstraction, and we generally represent time by space. You see, we draw a line and say that's time, right? Or on the face of the clock we see space, but we say it corresponds to time. So we never actually see time, but we see space and represent time through space. We experience it in various moments, let's say, but as the clock is experienced in different moments, our thought tells us that the time has passed. Now, but the thing is, that representation, however, is projected into our consciousness as if it were the same as the rainbow, as if it were something independently real, right? A perception. In other words, we have the impression that we exist in time, that the time is there. Right? Just as we would say the rainbow is an object that's there, but it's not, right? But the time can be useful or correct as a measure of the successive existence.
Dr. Bohm, today I just found in the school this related to the question of time. The now has greater significance than the tomorrow. In the now is all time, and to understand the now is to be free of time. This was one of Krishnamurti's, and I really found it very this moment related to time. So the now is the attention to the now is freedom from time.
Yes, but see, it's again the conditioning, which is the pollution, attaches us to time. You see, the notion that time is real, we are attached to it through the conditioning. The same I think we would need an insight.
Would you say we only see the effects of time, and that
Well,
is
no,
through
time.
memory?
We see the effects really of the successive existence, and we attribute that to time. Right? We attribute time to it. Right? See, but nobody ever sees time.
But that's just a sign for successive existence. Isn't
Yeah.
it? I mean, it's just a word.
Well, the time is a measure of successive existence, and you can measure it in many ways. You see, you can use the biological clock, or the seasons, or the Earth going around the sun. We can use all sorts of regular successive existence as a way of measuring successive existence, one against the other, right?
They're all notions of time.
Well, we then apply time to that and say we put them, we sort of map them all on a common time.
So why do we want to escape from time?
We're not trying to escape. You see, I think the difficulty is that time is necessary as an abstraction, right? Which will, if we want to meet, we agree to meet at a certain place, we must also meet at the same time, or we won't meet, right?
Yes.
Now, the time guides us to meet it in that way. Now, if the successive existence of the positions of the clocks are sufficiently parallel, then we will meet. If the clocks don't do that, we won't meet. So, just as a map will guide us through space, you see, time is a kind of map process, and the two together are called space-time. You see, now, in the classical physics, space and time are independent. But now in relativity, they are connected, and time becomes relative to the speed of the clock. You see, so now we know time is relative in ordinary experience, that sometimes it may seem a very short time, which is very long, or by the clock, or a very long time by the clock may seem a very short time by the clock may seem long, and a very long time may seem short. We cannot make sense of the notion that time is really something that is there. You see, that things are happening in time. Rather, time is the measure of things happening. Right? Is that clear the difference? Yeah.
When you say thought is an abstraction, I think we can understand that it's an abstraction of the whole. And then when you say time is an abstraction, what you just heard, it's time essentially, as we have learned to understand it, is also an abstraction of thought. The clock, for example.
The clock.
So that when, again, Krishnamurti used to say that thought is time and time is thought. They're both abstractions.
They're both abstractions, and they're both sort of very closely related. You see, first of all, is thought which determines time. Now, this abstraction, makes a representation which can be projected into consciousness as if it were a non-abstraction, but perceived. Right? But when you look, it isn't there. And so in the first case, the first point is that thought is psychological time. And the second point, however, physical time is measured by thought, but thought itself moves. Its movement could be measured in physical time or biological time. Right? You see, so we relate all these different kinds of time. Is that clear?
And then when you talk in terms of psychological time, which is how most of
the time you experience, you think you sense, right?
Yesterday and tomorrow.
Yes, well, now and yesterday and tomorrow. And you see, there are paradoxes in that. You have time is represented by a line in space, and you take a point, you represent it as the present. It divides the past from the future. But you see, if you see that the past does not exist, you see it's gone. The future does not yet exist. So this point divides what doesn't exist from what doesn't exist. So that way of looking at it doesn't make much sense. Right? You see, so you could say that the ordinary idea of time creates the thought of time creates an illusion as if time were actually there. And just as we can create the illusion that the self is actually there. Now, and that there also is created the illusion of movement, as in the cine camera, if a series of thoughts are close together. And that illusion of movement creates a much greater sense of reality, you see. I think I've seen these illusions where a lot of colored dots, you can't see anything in them but on the television. But as soon as they start to move, you find a leopard moving, so it brings it all together. And see, the becoming, this is an illusion of becoming.
This made by deceptive thought.
Well, it's not necessarily deceptive, but there is a deception in there in the sense that it leaves a residue in which makes one feel like, with all thoughts of great importance, that the urge to hold on. Right? You see, that there's a tremendous urge to hold on to this. It's not so easy to give it up. I mean, you can see that we can easily talk about giving it up. You see.
We use time to delay, like next Monday I'm going to go on a diet, or...
Well, yeah, that's another false use of time, you see, that you don't really mean it, right? But, you see, time can be used in all these ways, and correctly, or you can delay things really, or you can delay things that you'll never do. And also, the other point is that the illusion of the self is maintained by the combination of the space which thought projects and the time which it projects, right? The space would be, let's say, a center and a periphery. It would take, ordinarily, if I'm here, in order for something to reach out there to the wall, it will take time, and or to come back, you see. If it's light, it's such a short time that it doesn't matter, but we could think that the further something is away from us, the more time we have to think to deal with it. Now, so therefore, there could be the thought that we have time to deal with this process, a psychological process, and think about it, and then you see, we notice what it is, and it will take some time before we have to meet it, right? But that's not true, you see, because this process is already conditioning us. It's always there, constantly there. You see that there is no time to meet this process. It's always, you can't approach it that way. See, so all the ordinary uses of time don't really work, but they will work in the ordinary domain.
Is space just as much an illusion, those three dimensions, as the
it's not actually an illusion. An illusion is a perception which is false or which is deceptive. It's I don't know what we would call it. It's a representation.
So would the ending of space be like the same thing as the ending of time?
Yeah, but the space, as we know it, the space of which the self seems to exist, could also end because it's actually a representation. The self is represented as being somewhere in that space, in the center and the periphery, and also becoming in time. And you see, when it projects forward the goal of the becoming, it's like it's just an image and nothing becomes, right?
So what this gentleman is asking is, there's an illusion of continuity in space, whereas, and obviously there is a continuity, but there's also somehow a discontinuity.
Yeah, well, this space doesn't exist. You see, it's like taking the space in a painting. You see, you cannot have continuity or discontinuity there, right?
So it seems like limits don't exist either, right?
Well, they're abstractions.
So if you speak of the unlimited, since we define the unlimited by saying it does not have limits, then we don't have a definition for the limits or the unlimited.
Well, not ultimate. What we say, the unlimited, we can say, we know roughly from abstraction what the limited means, that we move toward that limit and then you go beyond it and it's different. Now, the unlimited would not have such an abstraction. We can't make an abstraction of the unlimited because every abstraction will limit it, and therefore it cannot be put in thought.
So David, would you say in Wholeness in the Implicate Order in your book, are you talking about the implicate order as being the unlimited rather?
Well, it can look at it that way, or we could.
And so the explicate order
is
constantly happening, but it seems to be in space and time because of thought.
Yes.
So thought is actually creating it ultimately.
Well, something like thought. You see that, but in addition, the thought of space or the explicate order may fit the reality, but we don't see exactly how it comes about. You see that by projecting this whole structure into consciousness and then guiding which guides our action, and if it guides it consistently, we have to say in some way there's a correspondence between what we call reality and this thought, right? Although it means the abstraction works, it's usable there. You see, like a map, there can be a map which is usable. It just has a few lines, highly abstract, but it's more useful than a map which has a tremendous amount of detail that you don't want. Right? And so there can be the time, we want to say, time and space as experienced within consciousness is an abstraction, you see, of thought, of the space that could be measured, you see. Now, but there might be an unlimited space that couldn't be measured, you know. Because measurement is also always thought. Right? And measurement establishes limits. Right?
Can you say that the dissolution of time thought would be now, the now?
Yes, it would have to be. It would have to be now. It would have, then, as you're quite right, say now is the unlimited. You see, but the now which we experience is limited. You see, but it isn't. It is actually an abstraction or a representation.
An awareness of that suggestion. You're suggesting that an awareness of that.
Oh, an insight into that. You see, now this whole structure of the self and time and the space in which the self exists, so on the center and the periphery, is part of the material process of thought, and the sense of security and pleasure, and you know that you can count on it, is all there also in the brain, and therefore it holds. See, it is not so easy to. It won't easily change. You need an insight. Once again, a tremendous energy which would sort of remove all that, which makes it hold. But you see, probably there would be a lot of fear if it starts to go, because it seems if everything goes, then it looks very fearful.
Except that it isn't there anyway, right?
But we know this abstractly, but according to what you seem to be perceiving, it is there. You see, that we are perceiving the representation of thought as if it were real and independent of thought, and then another thought comes along and says, there it is, you see. Is that clear what I mean? It's the same error that has been made all through with thought, that thought produces a result and then says, I didn't do it. It's there. And I'm only telling you what it is.
Actually speaking, the time isn't there.
Yes, it's not there. That's the suggestion. Yes, you see, all the evidence is that time is not there any more than the space in the television image is there. You see, the becoming in that image is there. See, there is no space in the television image, or it looks like three-dimensional space. It's the brain that projects it. And there's no time, there's no becoming. The objects which move don't change. They're not. Again, it's projected, abstracted, and if you have a great many elements of pictures shown in a very short time, then you will get a sense of becoming, right? There is an order of succession, but it is not. The becoming is not in the elements which are abstract in the picture, but rather in the movement of the electron beam that makes the picture. Now, that would be more accurate to call that becoming.
It's constant.
Well, it's repetitious, yeah. Yeah, it's there constantly, yeah.
I can't get out of it in language.
What?
I'm just saying I can't get out of it in language. Language reinforces time, or reinforces the cognition of time, the necessity of time.
Yes, well, it is necessary in a certain area. And
find a way to say it without invoking time, and I can't.
Yes, well, you see, the language is caught by saying it really treats existence as in time, right? Saying I exist at this time or over this time.
There are some languages, we had mentioned this before, there are some languages that point to that, like the Hopi language, where if you say, the boy ran away, it actually, the interpretation of it is the boy is running in my mind.
Oh, really?
So essentially,
is that what they're saying?
That's right. That's what they're saying. You may remember that Benjamin Lee Whorf suggested that quantum physics. Benjamin Lee Whorf, who was a linguist in the 30s and 40s, suggested that. Wrote something called an American Indian model of the universe, in which he suggested that physics, contemporary physics, might be better understood if it could be
in Hopi language.
Because there is no word for time.
Yeah.
It's all happening
Yes.
in the present, and that which is going to happen is manifesting as opposed to becoming. Right.
That's the other way of viewing the present, isn't it? Not that it's the point between what it doesn't exist and doesn't exist, but the present contains the past.
The present contains the past and the future, yeah. But see, each moment contains the whole, but there's a different emphasis in each moment. See what seems to be central. But but you see, as you go deeper and deeper into it, then the difference of the moments becomes less and less significant. You see, it's only on the surface that these difference of moments is so crucial. But in the deep structure, they're very similar.
So do we need to resolve the way we experience time and space in order to correct this quality of our mind?
Well, there has to be an insight into that. Yes, see, that's what I suggest. That we must use this quality of time and space to guide us in our ordinary activities. So we will not change the fact that we would still experience time and space. See, just as you experience this as a square object, although it's not also at the same time made of atoms. It's a mostly empty space. All of these have their validity in certain areas. And you see, unless you experience this object as such, you could not be correctly guided toward it. But at the same time, to say that that is the ground of it is wrong. You see, to say that the space which thought projects and the time which it projects is the ground of existence is not correct. This much you can see by looking at this thing. You see, it's saying that evidently it's like saying that we've got a lot of evidence that for Newton that many people knew that there was a lot of evidence that heavenly and earthly matter are not very different, but there was a compartment of the mind where this didn't penetrate, where the conditioning held it. So we could say we have evidence that here that that time and space as we experience it are not the ground of the thing, but an abstraction or a representation. But the conditioning is still holding. See? Now it would take an insight to break through that conditioning.
But if one person had the insight, it seems like it wouldn't do much good because we have to translate it to each other with words which are...
Well, I suggest maybe it could or it couldn't. I don't know. You see, if there were an insight into the words which would transmit it at the same time, see, which is not impossible.
It was a good pointer, I guess. Yeah. The words were a good pointer.
Yes, but you see, the insight thus far perhaps has not been good enough for that. You see, it's not able somehow to actually transmit the dissolution of the conditioning from one person to another.
It seems also, though, that the conditioning is actually not continuous. I think maybe there are discontinuities in the conditioning, and that there are moments when it sounds grandiose to say it, but that space and time, just in daily life or flash, stop. But there's something about the nature of thinking and the urge for continuity that very quickly covers that over.
Yes.
But I do think that often in the way that we talk about this, we make the conditioning sound so absolute and so solid, or that something has to happen to it and change it. And that may be true. There may be something to that. But it may also be true that it's more permeable than we often suggest that it is.
Yes, it could very readily be permeable. See, the television image, again, you could say is actually discontinuous spots, but if you see it from some distance roughly, it gives this sense of continuity. Now, if you were to inspect that image closely, you would see that it was highly discontinuous. Therefore, it isn't solid at all. Now, the image, the sense of time and space continuity produced by thought would be of that same nature. Therefore, it would allow the thing to be free, but insofar as the conditioning remains, then it would be an urge to come back. Inappropriately. You have to come back anyway to be able to direct yourself in relation to ordinary matter and so on.
But it may come back only enough to do that.
Yes. Yes, and then that there would be no tendency to hold it beyond the point where it would be necessary.
And it may be that there may appear to be a process in that it may take some playing around with that. It might not happen all at once. It might be that the permeability of the conditioning is apparent for a bit or for a moment, and then it's apparent again at some other time, and that you can play with the degree to which the conditioning reasserts itself, and that it may not be all at once or nothing. There may be what appears to be a process of experimenting with the results of seeing the permeability of the conditioning. It sounds very complex, but it's not, I don't think.
Well,
there's another way that we have of thinking about this which might need to be explored, which is something, if seen clearly, will go and never come back, So something might be seen very clearly, but then, it's come back. Oh, I guess I didn't see it. So you'd look back at that.
You didn't see the whole of it. You didn't see the conditioning. You see, the way the thing works is the chemical conditioning of the nervous system to hold it. You may have seen some part of it, but then the conditioning to hold it has not been seen. Now, if there's an insight which sees that and dissolves that, the insight works, and then the thing clears up, you see.
Seems like insights in science are readily transmissible. Although they're never complete, Newton's insights proved to be overridden by Einstein's mechanics, but they are readily transmissible and teachable because each century the body of science grows and scientific insights are accepted by the new.
The content is
in this
teachable.
area, it seems to be not so transmissible. Is that?
Well, let me first suggest something different, that the content of the insight is transmissible, but the actual structure is not. See, generally people learn it by learning the content and therefore turning it into conditioning. They don't actually learn the action of dissolving the conditioning at that moment, which the person who discovered it had. Now, they may do so, but I mean, in general, they don't. If somebody was in close contact with that person, then maybe it would happen, right? They may be working together.
More like that once Newton discovered the falseness of something, that conditioning wasn't instilled in the rest of the human race.
Oh yeah. You see, insofar as people learn this by just superimposing it on the conditioning, then they haven't had the insight. They have merely transmitted the content of that thought, you see, which followed the first flash of insight. As once the attachment to the old chemical attachment to the old thought is gone, the new thought is a fairly straightforward thing. Now, then people can pick up that new thought, and in some sense they realize the old one is gone, but they didn't actually remove this conditioning in the sense that there's still, it's hard to say exactly what happened, but on the other hand, if it's taught properly by a teacher who really feels a lot of energy, then maybe it does, you see.
Sort of like destructuring.
Yeah. Well, it dissolves. Like if you say you have a lot of droplets of smog or fog, and a very intense light comes, which dispels it, you see,
amount of deconstructionism, the fashionable thing at the moment, has that as an intention, is to start breaking down structures in the hopes of seeing what might be there. I mean, it gets to be very playful at times, but there is that quality that makes it very appealing too.
Yes. Yes, I think that what we need is to, to realize that the breakdown of the structure requires the breakdown not only of the content of the idea, but also the actual structure that holds it. You see, the insight dispels that, and and I think that the passion with which the teacher would do this would help communicate that. You see, in other words, that merely giving the right content is not necessarily going to give the whole thing. You see.
There's still physicists, aren't there, who are trying to show that Einstein's relativity theory was incorrect.
Well, it's always possible to make other theories which would, in a certain area, do the same thing. You see, like the epicycles. And, Einstein's theory is much neater, and it's said to be elegant and beautiful. You see, this is one of the major criteria. Simple, elegant, and beautiful. And that's spelled to be a sign of truth. Right? See, and it does actually work that way. In some sense. It doesn't always, but it does.
What did you said the passion with which it's communicated?
Well, you see, in order to have that insight, Newton had to have a lot of passion, which may have arisen from the frustration. But the teacher may also have this insight and has enough energy to communicate what is meant by breaking the bond of the conditioning.
There's some way that the teacher participates so that a learner doesn't just have it's not just secondary imagination following it, but there's
the primary imagination.
Yeah. So can you talk more about what conditions or qualities of participation that you see to allow that?
Well, I don't quite see the question, you see. It's 10 minutes of 7. We have about at most 7 o'clock. Right?
David, would you say that a particular insight, the energy, which is, as you could use the analogy of a laser, would be a particular insight? A general insight, would you call that, would the analogy be what we would refer to as enlightenment?
Well, you could. I don't know what it means. But you say that the general insight would be far more extensive and stronger than the particular. The insight into the particular.
So the general insight would be the whole structure.
The whole structure, the most general insight possible in this area would be the whole structure of thought, including time and the self, and the attachment to it, electrochemical attachment to it.
Where does the necessity for the electrochemical attachment derive from?
Well, we know that every thought is accompanied by electrical currents and neurochemicals which produce strong feelings, pleasure, pain, fear, all that. And see, those feelings, felt, we call them, from the past, will then produce an attachment, you see, because they will produce that tendency to hold this thought. Because if this thought goes, then the chemicals go, and you lose the sense of security and pleasure, or you're threatened with a fearful situation, and so on.
When you were talking earlier about this passion of the teacher, wouldn't that in some way be the way that this insight lives now, not as memory, so that in their participation with learners, that they are living into it now, learning into it together, and so it's somehow mutualized, that may sustain a learner through that kind of shift in how they're coherent meaning, so that it's a primary movement.
Well, possibly, there's a shared meaning between the teacher and the one who learns, and the teacher can get a sense of what the block is there, and with passion, say, try to dispel it, right?
Would it also have to do with having the insight now?
That
the teacher was actually...
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's right. Yes. You see, the insight is, in some sense, free of time, right?
Right. The insight is energy of timeless.
Yeah. Yeah, so... see, if the teacher is not very interested, then he's not going to communicate insight, or or if the student is not interested.
About this general insight, I get the impression that very likely everyone in this room, at least everyone who's taken the trouble to come here and consider this sort of thing, has had some experience of this general insight.
Oh, right,
otherwise, we'd be totally stuck in the old structures of thought that people who think we're rather silly to come and do this sort of thing would hold.
Yes, but when you have an insight, you see, you have to say it can always be imitated by conditioning. The question is whether it actually is one. You see that, and you have to have some way of testing it, and so on. To see whether it is an insight, and see if you can communicate it, see if it stands up in different ways, and so on. Because you can get what feels like an insight but isn't. Especially, say, by taking some drugs. I don't know that with some of the drugs they take, like ecstasy or LSD, you see people think they're having tremendous insight. When they write it down, it seems trivial. Like with the LSD, the person had a tremendous insight, and he wrote it down. He woke up and he said, if you raise your hand, you will touch the ceiling.
Be a general agreement that the pervasive structures of thought are not quite as solid as most people think they are. It must have taken some kind of insight of everyone here to have got a picture of that.
Well, perhaps it had some perception. Some perception of this openness of structure.
But perception is not insight.
It may be a partial perception. It doesn't necessarily dissolve the conditioning to get a perception of the openness.
And maybe the perception helps a little bit to the rigidity, to be loose.
It makes it a certain move. But see, I think that it's again a matter of this passionate concern with learning and with facing the suffering, the frustration, and the liberation of that energy in the insight.
It would seem that the perception, if we're talking about really using it, would have to be a sort of a dynamic perception, in that it's an ongoing thing. I think maybe perhaps that's what Lee was alluding to before with regard to the fact that there are these moments. If you're working it, the insights will happen that way, but it's a dynamic process as opposed to instant. Helene used the word before, enlightenment. A lot of people think that you get it and put it in your pocket and it's over, but it seems like you got to work at it.
Yes, but well, at least this work makes possible the energy. It doesn't actually do it.
So the insight is then really seeing the total.
Yes, all the relevant total. Yes, all that is relevant to this incoherence. Right? Not merely that the idea, the thought doesn't correspond to the fact, but also that it contradicts itself, but also this conditioning to hold it. Right? Yeah, this electrochemical conditioning. And the insight actually, even a thought is always, as I said, changing the brain. If you take X-rays or other nuclear magnetic resonance pictures of the brain, and every time somebody thinks, the blood is moving all over the place, and so even thought profoundly affects the structure, but it is too gross and crude to actually touch this conditioning in an intelligent way. You see, if it did, it might wipe out a vast block of it, and it would be lost. Right? Right. Well, I think we're coming to the end now. It's 5 minutes to 7. Okay. So I hope then that we will meet again within a reasonable period of time. Perhaps not over a year. And I hope then we will work on this meanwhile, both individually and collectively. Homework. And
Dr. Bohm, thank you so much, you and Mrs. Bohm and all of you, because I think this one is really as a different quality. If I see that from all the rest of the previous ones, and I can see that the jumping of the thought was far more less, at least I can see mine, than before. It's far more peaceful, the conditioning. It's not as rigid, and it's not as like an insect, keep jumping. I can see the difference in comparison to all the previous ones, since I was lucky one to participate in every one of them. And I can see really the difference. And I can see, and it is not, of course, the words is not sufficient to how grateful we are for you that you came. We only, the request is if you can come more often and stay a little longer.
Yes, well,
what are you doing next week?
We'll have to decide that, but I hope if within a year anyway, I'll be back again, or perhaps for a longer period.
Thank you, David.